Section 39 of Gray's Anatomy, Part 3. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. Recording by Eric Hale. Anatomy of the Human Body, Part 3, by Henry Gray. The veins of the upper extremity and thorax. The veins of the upper extremity are divided into two sets, superficial and deep. The two sets anastomose frequently with each other. The superficial veins are placed immediately beneath the integument between the two layers of superficial fascia. The deep veins accompany the arteries and constitute the venae comitatus of those vessels. Both sets are provided with valves, which are more numerous in the deep than in the superficial veins. The superficial veins of the upper extremity. The superficial veins of the upper extremity are the digital, metacarpal, cephalic, basilic, median. Digital veins. The dorsal digital veins pass along the sides of the fingers and are joined to one another by oblique communicating branches. Those from the adjacent sides of the fingers unite to form three dorsal metacarpal veins, which end in a dorsal venous network opposite the middle of the metacarpus. The radial part of the network is joined by the dorsal digital vein from the radial side of the index finger and by the dorsal digital veins of the thumb, and is prolonged upward as the cephalic vein. The ulnar part of the network receives the dorsal digital vein of the ulnar side of the little finger, and is continued upward as the basilic vein. A communicating branch frequently connects the dorsal venous network with the cephalic vein about the middle of the forearm. The volar digital veins on each finger are connected to the dorsal digital veins by oblique intercapitular veins. They drain into a venous plexus which is situated over the thenar and hypothenar eminences and across the front of the wrist. The cephalic vein begins in the radial part of the dorsal venous network and winds upward around the radial border of the forearm, receiving tributaries from both surfaces. Below the front of the elbow, it gives off the vena mediana cubiti, which receives a communicating branch from the deep veins of the forearm and passes across to join the basilic vein. The cephalic vein then ascends in front of the elbow in the groove between the brachioradialis and the biceps brachii. It crosses superficial to the musculocutaneous nerve and ascends in the groove along the lateral border of the biceps brachii. In the upper third of the arm, it passes between the pectoralis major and deltoideus, where it is accompanied by the deltoid branch of the thoracoacromial artery. It pierces the coracoclavicular fascia and, crossing the axillary artery, ends in the axillary vein just below the clavicle. Sometimes it communicates with the external jugular vein by a branch which ascends in front of the clavicle. The accessory cephalic vein arises either from a small tributary plexus on the back of the forearm or from the ulnar side of the dorsal venous network. It joins the cephalic below the elbow. In some cases, the accessory cephalic springs from the cephalic above the wrist and joins it again higher up. A large oblique branch frequently connects the basilic and cephalic veins on the back of the forearm. The basilic vein begins in the ulnar part of the dorsal venous network. It runs up the posterior surface of the ulnar side of the forearm and inclines forward to the anterior surface below the elbow, where it is joined by the vena mediana cubiti. It ascends obliquely in the groove between the biceps brachii and pronator teres, and crosses the brachial artery, from which it is separated by the lacertus fibrosus. Filaments of the medial antibrachial cutaneous nerve pass both in front of and behind this portion of the vein. It then runs upward along the medial border of the biceps brachii, perforates the deep fascia a little below the middle of the arm, and, ascending on the medial side of the brachial artery to the lower border of the teres major, is continued onward as the axillary vein. The median antibrachial vein drains the venous plexus on the volar surface of the hand. It ascends on the ulnar side of the front of the forearm and ends in the basilic vein or in the vena mediana cubiti. In a small proportion of cases, it divides into two branches, one of which joins the basilic, the other the cephalic, below the elbow. The deep veins of the upper extremity. The deep veins follow the course of the arteries, forming their venae comitantes. They are generally arranged in pairs, and are situated one on either side of the corresponding artery, and connected at intervals by short transverse branches. Deep veins of the hand. The superficial and deep volar arterial arches are each accompanied by a pair of venae comitantes. The superficial and deep volar arterial arches are each accompanied by a pair of venae comitantes, which constitute respectively the superficial and deep volar venous arches, and receive the veins corresponding to the branches of the arterial arches. Thus, the common volar digital veins, formed by the union of the proper volar digital veins, open into the superficial, and the volar metacarpal veins into the deep volar venous arches. The dorsal metacarpal veins receive perforating branches from the volar metacarpal veins and end in the radial veins and in the superficial veins on the dorsum of the wrist. The deep veins of the forearm are the venae comitantes of the radial and ulnar veins, and constitute respectively the upward continuations of the deep and superficial volar venous arches. They unite in front of the elbow to form the brachial veins. The radial veins are smaller than the ulnar and receive the dorsal metacarpal veins. The ulnar veins receive tributaries from the deep volar venous arches and communicate with the superficial veins at the wrist. Near the elbow, they receive the volar and dorsal interosseous veins and send a large communicating branch, profunda vein, to the vena mediana cubiti. The brachial veins are placed one on either side of the brachial artery, receiving tributaries corresponding with the branches given off from that vessel. Near the lower margin of the subscapularis, they join the axillary vein. The medial one frequently joins the basilic vein. The axillary vein begins at the lower border of the teres major, as the continuation of the basilic vein increases in size as it ascends, and ends at the outer border of the first rib as the subclavian vein. Near the lower border of the subscapularis, it receives the brachial veins, and, close to its termination, the cephalic vein. Its other tributaries correspond with the branches of the axillary artery. It lies on the medial side of the artery, which it partly overlaps. Between the two vessels are the medial cord of the brachial plexus, the median, the ulnar, and the medial anterior thoracic nerves. It is provided with a pair of valves opposite the lower border of the subscapularis. Valves are also found at the ends of the cephalic and subscapular veins. The subclavian vein, the continuation of the axillary, extends from the outer border of the first rib to the sternal end of the clavicle, where it unites with the internal jugular to form the innominate vein. It is in relation, in front, with the clavicle and subclavius, behind and above, with the subclavian artery, from which it is separated medially by the scalenus anterior and the phrenic nerve. Below, it rests in a depression on the first rib and upon the pleura. It is usually provided with a pair of valves, which are situated about 2.5 centimeters from its termination. The subclavian vein occasionally rises in the neck to a level with the third part of the subclavian artery, and occasionally passes with this vessel behind the scalenus anterior. Tributaries. This vein receives the external jugular vein, sometimes the anterior jugular vein, and occasionally a small branch, which ascends in front of the clavicle from the cephalic. At its angle of junction with the internal jugular, the left subclavian vein receives the thoracic duct, and the right subclavian vein the right lymphatic duct. The veins of the thorax. The innominate veins are two large trunks, placed one on either side of the root of the neck, and formed by the union of the internal jugular and subclavian veins of the corresponding side. They are devoid of valves. The right innominate vein is a short vessel, about